And we're into our final session for the day, where we're really investigating, I guess what we've done so far today when we look back across the program is we've been able to reflect upon, 15, 20 years of investigation into thinking about entrepreneurship and creative bureaucracies through Charles's presentation. We've been able to have a look at a little bit of thinking about how we do entrepreneurship and how we develop that as a practice, and start to sort of think about, how we might start to bolster that and do it even better. And here we're casting our eye into what I would say is the near-term future. If you were in our last session, Lois Boswell had a great slide which sort of showed. My favourite example was the BlackBerry being invented in 1999 and government trying to prevent its use in 2006 because smartphones were going to be really difficult to do in government. So I think when I'm thinking about some of these issues that are coming up for us, the world is changing around us very, very quickly. And what we often think of future issues are actually current issues, but current issues that might take a while to filter down to our practices or to the practices that we have with communities. And it's worth us starting to think about how might these create step changes or big shifts in the way that we can do things, and how might we apply some of this thinking to the practices that we've learnt about today. So with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Pip Ryan, who is a barrister and lecturer at the University of Technology in Sydney. Dr. Ryan's expertise is commercial equity and legal technologies, and her PhD formulated a new classification for the liability of third parties to breach of trust. Her current research explores the breach of fiduciary duty in apparently trustless commercial relationships. And so this includes things obviously like blockchain technologies. Dr. Ryan designed and coordinated a commercial equity elective that examines directors' duties, Ponzi schemes, and the trust as an alternative to corporate arrangement. And her teaching research investigates how authentic legal processes can improve law students' problem solving. She works with the UTS Connected Intelligence Centre, piloting the use of discourse analytics software to improve law students' legal writing skills. There is a whole lot of really interesting tangents that come together in Pip's work, and I'd like you to join us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me here today. So I'm on the Blockchain Technical Committee for Standards Australia, and I'm the chair of the Smart Contracts Working Group. And I love telling the story about how it came to be that Australia is running the Global Secretariat for exploring whether standards should be imposed on blockchain. So about 2 years ago, I had written a couple of pieces about blockchain. I'd become interested in it because in 2015, a colleague sent me an email and said, "Oh, you'll be really interested in this technology. Apparently, it enables trustlessness." And he knew I had done a PhD on breach of trust. And I remember the blood rushing out of my head, and I thought, how did I write a PhD on breach of trust and I have never heard the term trustlessness? So I Googled it, and unfortunately what came up was an ad for Ashley Madison that said, "Life's short, why not have an affair?" So I quickly shut down that. I had to clear my Google search history because I really like my husband. And then I thought, ooh, this is a really, really interesting moment in time. There's this thing called blockchain, which I'd never heard of. I'd heard of Bitcoin. And then there was this thing, trustlessness, and I thought, I'll do a search and see if I can find how many hits I get in Google for blockchain and trustlessness, and there were 8. So I took a screenshot. It was so prescient of me. It was the 13th of October, 2015, and there were 8 hits. Now, if you do that search now, you basically break the internet. So on this exploring about trustlessness, I wrote a couple of pieces for the conversation, and that's how Standards Australia got me in their sights. And they said, would you help us with some submissions to the International Standards Organisation to say 2 things. 1, we need to explore standards for blockchain, and 2, Australia should run the Secretariat. So the way it works is they put it out to the member countries, and if they get more than about 5 saying, yes, it's a thing, then off we go. The next question is, who gets to run it? So basically Russia, Germany, America, England, Canada, the Netherlands all put their hand up and said, oh yeah, we need to do this work. And then they said, and we need to run it. And they all gave arguments as to why they should run the Secretariat. But as it turned out, they all hated each other more then Australia. Then they hated Australia. So a bit like Stephen Bradbury going around that ice rink and being the last man standing, that's how we got the Secretariat. So that was announced in September 2016, and since then I have found myself buried in this very strange world. Sometimes it is like being in the United Nations. There's 220 experts working on this worldwide. There are 35 countries, and Australia is running the show, which is incredibly good fun. Now, if this clicker works, this will be a great testament to my technological abilities. So what I want to discuss today is promises, pain points and paradoxes. And I could go on with the Ps, I could alliterate all afternoon. But I am going to speak to all three, but I think that there's a little bit of ground clearing to do first. And the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves, what on earth does she mean by the automation of trust? So automation, I think we all understand. I mean, I've just been at Tonsley this morning, and it's really ironic being in a place where 25 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, that kind of automation was vehicles, manufacturing, and large production lines. And what we do now is pretty much all of that, but it's digital. And automation includes things like removing humans from the go button. We can use artificial intelligence to create enough information to satisfy a complex conditional question in an algorithm that then says sell or buy or trade or do X or report on X or do such and such a transaction, transfer money. Now, the interesting thing about this is human beings are very funny about automation. I've only really just started doing deep research on this, but so far, and I have no empirical evidence, but I've read a fair bit around this. Human beings are pretty good if we automate something that results in a purely digital transaction. But if we automate something that's digital and ends up with a financial transaction, we get a little concerned. But what really freaks us out is when we automate something digitally that then affects something in our physical world. So things like a set and forget account to pay my electricity, I'm pretty comfortable because I've got a long-standing relationship with the electricity services provider. But an automated vehicle that's going to be on the same road where I'm driving, that makes me a little nervous. And this is why pilots, when we're at 35,000 feet somewhere on the Pacific, they don't go, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to put the plane into autopilot while I have a sleep. They do put it into autopilot and have a little sleep. They just don't tell us because it freaks us out. So when we think about automation, that's the first step is, well, what's it doing? What is the automated thing going to actually do? And is it a combination? And like an escalator, will there be a stop button if something needs to pause while we fix whatever the problem is and then go back to travelling on the escalator? That's a metaphor, by the way. There's no escalator. So then we come to trust. Now, obviously, when I talk about breach of trust, I'm talking about breach of fiduciary duty or breach of a custodial duty, and I could talk about that for a couple of hours, and after a couple of drinks, I'm very funny. But trust me, it's nowhere near as interesting as the other kind of trust, which is not an express trust, like an arrangement where, for widows and orphans, we hold monies on account. What I'm talking about is the verb to trust someone, to have faith or confidence that something or someone is going to conduct something in a certain way on our behalf. So they're acting in agency. But it could be that the thing or the person is unknown to us. So how do we establish trust? And this is a problem. You know, the internet solved and introduced a whole lot of it solved a whole lot of problems and introduced some wonderful opportunities for us. But it created a whole new suite of problems. This is where blockchain comes in. The promise is, and this is where we come to the first promise, is that it can solve some of the problems that happen when we need to deal with people we're never going to meet. Because when humans meet, we have all this amazing suite of skills, including things like assessing demeanour. And that's why being a con man, and it could be con woman, is actually quite a valuable skill. If I could con you and make a lot of money from it, that is actually quite a good skill because people are very good at assessing when people are lying. But how do you do that across the internet? This is not so easy. And look, I'll give you a little Easter egg. You can take this away and discuss this at dinner parties for hours and everyone will think you're terribly interesting. AI, artificial intelligence, is very good at doing the stuff that Albert Einstein found very difficult. So AI can calculate and prove theories of relativity very easily. What AI is not very good at is stuff that 2-year-olds find very easy, which is things like recognising someone's voice or their face, someone familiar. AI really struggles with that. So when you are automating things, you have to ask yourself, well, where does AI fit into it? Where does calculation, where does computation fit into it? And when will it be good at it and not good at it? Because when you talk about trust, you're talking about the assessment of risk. Risk and valuing risk is how we decide whether to trust something. Do I do a $2 download of a song, knowing that if it doesn't work, I only lost $2? And would I use the same technology to pay for a $1.2 million house in Adelaide? Probably not. And so we've got an appetite for certain types of trust, and you have to ask the question, what's the risk? And sometimes you don't need 100% trust. Sometimes you just need a little bit of trust, or a little bit of trust, and then a bit of experience, or you know enough about this person's expertise. So expertise and experience and how time plays out become really valuable. So this is a picture of a building that still exists, but I believe it's got a Westpac branding on it now. This is how it looked when it was the State Bank Centre. And this is the last time I was in Adelaide. So this is a bit nostalgic for me. So I was last in Adelaide about 21 years ago. Yes, I was working for a major law firm, and we were briefed to defend the auditors, KPMG Peak Marwick, in relation to the collapse of the State Bank of South Australia. And I'll never forget getting in the taxi at the airport, and the driver said, "Where to, love?" There was no Uber. I actually had to get a taxi. There's a whole group of you here who won't know quite what that experience is like, but it's very human. You do talk to the person. You do a financial transaction in the vehicle, really old school. And I said, "Oh, I'm off to the State Bank Centre." And he said, "You're not working on that case, are you? You're not a lawyer." I was in my 20s. I was so naive. I went, "Oh, yeah," thinking that was a really good answer. I would never say that now. So he said, "Well, let me tell you about that bank. They wrote to me and they said I'm $6 overdrawn." So I wrote back and told them they're $6 billion overdrawn. So that was my welcome to Adelaide. So I worked on that case for a number of years. And the reason why I wanted to raise this is because it was a very interesting time and it was completely different to now. I did not have a mobile phone. I got my first mobile phone in 1998. I still have the same number, which is really cool. We used a lot of fax machines and photocopiers, and all the documents we were inspecting were in hard copy. I'm going to tell you the percentage of documents that came into that discovery that were generated from the years 1993 to 1990 that were in electronic form, and the answer is 0, not 1. But if you go into the Supreme Court of Adelaide, of South Australia or New South Wales on any given day, 100% of the documents will have existed originally in digital form. And there's more of them. They proliferate. We had no such thing as deduplicating the documents. We had to use what we call Mark I eyeball. We had to read the documents. Humans actually had to read the documents. Gets a little boring, but it has its benefits. I'll tell you in a minute what they are. So this is what it looks like. This is what a discovery looks like, and it is incredibly boring, and it's very, very slow, and the technology has changed. But one of the problems we have is we create data, metadata, or aggregated data, or inferred data. These are all different kinds of data based on what we're reading. And we come up with solutions, answers, questions. And the question that exists above all of that is, what's the quality of the data? Who decided what's in and what's out? Who wrote the algorithm? And looking under the hood is part of creating the trust. You need to be able to stand in front of that data set and say, I know its history and I can trust that it can be relied upon, because bad data leads to bad decisions. So we had this mess of documents, and I love this picture. I'm sure that's me with the hand up on the right-hand side. But I love that all the tech is there. You know, we've got filing cabinets, documents, there's a photocopier, a fax machine, and it's ancient history. People died, marriages ended, love flourished while we read all these documents. I got so bored I started flirting with junior counsel, but I can tell that story because we're married now. So where does trust fit into the question about blockchain and about technical solutions? Because just as technology has created the problem that we have now with trusting data, so too can technology solve the problem. And this is where we start to look at blockchain. Now, if you're normal, your eyes should glaze over right now and you should all think, is it going to be a Shiraz or is it going to be a Chardonnay after she's finished? Actually, there's another speaker after me, so keep it going. The way that we establish trust in blockchain is with a series of very, very clever cryptographic steps. Now, most of the time with a presentation, people just skip over this bit and just go, it's too hard to explain. But I've got time, I can do this. So this is Milton Friedman. In 1976, he won the Nobel Prize for economics. He'd come up with some theory of consumerism in capitalist markets. I don't understand it. But there's a very cool video of him on YouTube dated 1998 in which he's asked the question, Mr. Friedman, or Dr. Friedman, Professor, what do you think is the future of the internet? And he said, oh, it's going to be interesting, but it's going to be really interesting when we have digital cash and people start doing financial transactions online between people and without the banks. He saw it, and he said, it's going to threaten government because people are going to use it to avoid tax and to launder money. He was right, it's brilliant. Because here we have Bitcoin, the biggest tax haven in the world, and it is the killer app that proves that blockchain can do what it promises. Now, what does it say it can do? Peer-to-peer transactions, think Napster, but not for music file sharing, but for sharing data, information, and financial transactions. Napster is the beginning, the fons et origo of what we're talking about here. And we're 10 years now into the time since the launch of Bitcoin, and 9 years since the first one was released into the system, and already it's showing cracks. It's cracking. It's not going to survive. But it is always going to be regarded with affection as the app that proved what blockchain promises it can do, which is create trustless relationships. And it does that because it solved a number of problems. The first one is the double spending problem. Since the 1970s, there have been a number of attempts to solve this problem. And why would you do that? Well, it starts with things like university campuses and naval ships, trying to create ways to say, let's create a little microcosm of a money that can be an exchange of value online, but that you would never spend the same value twice. And nobody solved it until we got to blockchain. And it does it by creating a unique file record and then advertising that to everybody and then rewarding miners to prove that everything that was said in that block, every 12 minutes or so, the block comes to a stop, is signed off, and the miners get rewarded for solving the little puzzle to say everything's correct and it becomes immutable. It also solved the Byzantine generals' problem. The Byzantine generals' problem is you've got two generals, they're fighting on the same side in the same war, and one of them wants to send a message to someone else telling them, you need to get moving, we need to act, and we need to maybe attack, I don't know, the state of Victoria. Wouldn't that be fun? But your problem is you might send a runner who's actually a rogue or a spy or who's been infiltrating Facebook and selling fake news. Somebody has created a way of misinforming a very important decision. How do you make sure everybody knows exactly what the next move is, but not the enemy? You tell everyone in your network. You just tell everyone. You might actually hide the message with a bit of cryptographic code. Think Enigma, World War II. It's a very common old school way to communicate. You wrap it up in a code, you give everybody who cares the key, and they can keep an eye on the ledger. So that's how blockchain achieves consensus. And yes, it's consuming a lot of electricity, but hello, so's MasterCard, Visa, Amex, but nobody's asking them how much electricity it's taking because they won't tell. At least blockchain is transparent enough to tell us, yes, it's consuming the electricity that it takes to fuel Ireland. The next thing it does is this. This is a cryptic crossword. Anybody who's familiar with cryptic crosswords or English language will be able to look at that and say, that is correct. Every single one of those words is idiomatically or even just spelling a real word in English. The word disobedience, one across, it's a real word. It's not gobbledygook. You could look at that and at a glance say, if that's proof of work, it looks right to me. Problem is, you don't know what the clues were. And the other problem may be that you don't know how to solve a cryptic. So the question for one across is non-compliance. Well, there's the quick. Okay, that's the quick clue in the cryptic. Non-compliance, disobedience. But the cryptic bit is by foundation, bed, admitted by diocese in broadcast. Broadcast is the clue to turn any words nearby into an anagram. So you would use diocese in with the word bed, mix it all around, disobedience, which means non-compliance. There's your answer. Now, if that mattered to me, if it really mattered to me that that was correct, and I wanted to run maybe an economy the size of South Australia on whether that's correct, I would pay people to solve that problem. I would incentivise it by maybe giving them some Bitcoin. And then I would say, whoever solves it first, you get the Bitcoin. So what would you do? If you wanted to make a whole lot of money solving these little puzzles, you would use supercomputers that are really good at anagrams. Because you would understand the key, you'd know what you've got to do, and then you would race everybody by using a supercomputer. This is a very simple analogy for how crypto mining works. You're incentivizing people to prove the work that's being done to get to where we are at this current state. This is also a proof of work. And I love this because we're in the home of the Torrens system. Certificate of title, you can go through this document and you can say, I could run a historical search on every single piece of information on that certificate of title and I can prove that it's correct. But the other thing I'm allowed to do under the Torrens system is it's indefeasible. If I say today that that's the status of that block of land, no one can defeat it. And when I was doing my PhD, I said to my supervisors, should I be doing something about the Torrens system and indefeasibility while I'm also exploring the way that we claw back property from knowing recipients? And my supervisors just said, no, just put a little footnote, this thesis will not explore the Torrens system, because it offends so much about what we understand about fraud. But it defeats fraud by saying, whoever's on the title owns the property. If you think the property's properly yours, you're going to have to bring a court case and ask for something. But it's very unlikely that we're going to change the title on there, because that's indefeasible. That's also how blockchain works. So when you sign off on the block, it's finalised, it's immutable, no one can change it, you just move forward. You should look at this sometime. This is a live viewing of every single smart contract. This is a screenshot, but I have actually provided the slides with the link embedded in it. So if you want to ask anyone who's got control of these slides, if you can have the link, it is in the slide, and you're welcome to have these, because I'm so generous. But you can actually see every single smart contract on the Ethereum network operating. The Ethereum network is the biggest smart contracts network in the world. It has thousands of nodes exchanging millions of dollars in value on Ethereum every single day. And why do we want smart contracts? Because it's the smart contracts on blockchain networks that enable us to track real products from A to B. So there's the promises. These are the promises blockchain can offer. We can track the origin and we can track the destination and the quality of what's happening with grain, fruit, milk, as it travels, and then you can work out when it arrives that it is actually Australian and it was kept in the condition that it should have been, or that the sheep were alive on board that ship, that the temperature didn't get to 36 degrees during a live export. All of this is possible with just a very simple app on a phone that's reporting from nodes that are all connected to this blockchain network. So, the most important thing is that statistically on a supply chain, well, let's go with the supply chain first. No one on a supply chain really wants to share all the information that they need to in order for the proof of work to be done, because sometimes they're competitors or there's private information or commercial in confidence information within those transactions. Does the grower of the wheat or the grape need to know how much the carrier was paid when they dropped it off at the port in Shanghai? The answer is probably no. So you want to keep that quiet. How do you do the proof? It's called a zero-knowledge proof. Has anyone heard of a zero-knowledge proof? Oh, this is awesome. Save it. It's the most sophisticated statistical way of solving a major blockchain problem. Does anyone know who that is? Who's the person? Okay, so here's a question. You don't know what a zero-knowledge proof is, and you have no knowledge of this guy. I'm going to help you prove, without knowing anything about this person, who it is. I'm going to ask you if you're willing to bet any money on that being the president of Suriname. A small amount of money? What if I was going to double your money if it is the president of Suriname? Anybody with me? Okay, what about your house? You're willing to bet your house that that's the president of Suriname? Okay, that's interesting. Anyone else? No. Let's go with the zero knowledge proofers at the moment. So, what if I put a random person next to this photo and said one of them is the president of Suriname? What's the percentage chance that that's the president of Suriname? 100 or 50? 0? Anyone want to say? 50. Thank you. Excellent. It's good to know someone in the South Australian government is capable of that. Okay, so we've got a 50% chance, but look at the next slide and tell me what you think. So now one of them is the president of Suriname. Is anyone 100% certain that it's the gentleman on the left? Thank you. Without knowing anything about that person, you now know it's 100% certain because I gave you some external information. That's a zero knowledge proof. Knowing nothing about the person on the left, statistically we created a certainty that that is the president of Suriname. So why do we care? We care because maybe it's not the president of Suriname, maybe it's a Barossa Shiraz. Maybe it's a bottle of wine that's been grown here and there's someone in China pretending that their wine came from the Barossa Valley and has the same name. They're faking the label, they're faking the made in Australia. It's actually just a cooking wine that's sold as a concentrate. The label's been faked, and actually I'll go back, think about this. So let's just talk about that quickly. Why do we care? 3 things. There are 3 things that food people care about in Australia. Number 1, Australia's reputation as a producer of fine wine, and South Australia's in that. So you produce your fine wine and you actually care about the market, because if somebody in China who's a major buyer of red wine thinks, I can't trust those red wine labels from Australia anymore, they're not going to want to sell them for the kind of premium they could. They need to know they can trust the label. The second thing is the Australian government and food security people care because we have food security rules. And those rules make sure that when you drink that wine, you're not going to suddenly have listeria, which is what's happening with frozen vegetables coming out of Hungary and what was happening with rock melon last year. So you need to know you're not going to get sick from it. And the third one is we have a regulator that says the wine market must be competitive. You are not allowed to engage in anti-competitive practices. Now, if you've got a robot or any kind of algorithm that has been programmed to protect your business, you have to be very, very careful that it doesn't start to be so protective that it starts to behave anti-competitively. This is a real problem. The head of the ACCC last year said, if your algorithm starts to behave anti-competitively, it won't be an excuse to say my robot did it. You will have to actually make sure you understand the algorithm and what it's working with so that it doesn't offend some of those pretty fundamental rules in the Australian market. And why do we want to be anti-competitive? Because if we are competitive, then only the best produce is actually going to survive in a competitive market, and that's good for everyone. Data erasure. This is a pain point. So the reason why this is one of the pain points is because we know now that we have 3 different data regimes that we're sitting under. We've got the really basic Privacy Act and all the principles that are attached to that. Then we've got the mandatory data breach notification rules that came in on the 18th of February. And then the next one is the GDPR, which came in on the 25th of May. Now, GDPR, European privacy rules, basically impact everybody in the world. And their penalties are unbelievably, they're so onerous that they can put businesses out of business. Now, how does that work? Why do they get to dictate that to us? Well, they just do, because that's a global market. And again, it's an internet story. We're not talking about information that's in my little book. We're talking about the computational information that we're all putting online. And if you've got personal information that's being stored by an organisation and there's a data breach, in Australia, there are certain saves for organisations. You know, it comes down to how much money, what kind of information. The Europeans are nowhere near as good. And they have this thing called the right to be forgotten. So you've got data breach notification and you've got the right to be forgotten. These are pain points because, number one, why aren't we saying, and if I was in charge of the whole world, particularly Australia, I would change the law right now and say that we should say you're going to keep the data private You're going to keep it secure and confidential, comma, except as required by law. Because there are laws in this country and in the States that demand that you disclose certain data that puts you in breach of the European data protection rules. And if you want the right to be forgotten, how does that work when deleting you creates a file that you existed, and there are obligations to archive, including digital archive, for a certain number of years? How do you comply with the data retention law if you also need to comply with I want to be erased law? So these are not just pain points, these are paradoxes. And the final paradox, which I can come to, with the last 7 minutes, this is awesome. So we're all required to back up. Does anybody here not have a backup plan? Oh, I shouldn't do that, that's not fair. Okay, everybody agree we all need to back up. Everybody should be backing up their data. Now, we all back up to the cloud these days. In fact, a lot of us store to the cloud. And why do we do that? Because I want to access my documents on my phone from my Dropbox and then send them to someone's file because I don't have my computer with me, and then I can just work on their computer, having sent it to my own email address. The convenience of what we call cloud technology is extraordinary, and it enables most of the apps that we use today. It's why you don't have 13 floppy disks when you install Word on your system. Word is sitting in the cloud, you're just using an app that gives you access to it, and then you put the data in the cloud and you walk around with these agile little devices that run all of the apps that tell us when to catch the train and what's going on with our bank accounts. So this is all great. All of this data backing up is absolutely fantastic, but I've got a son-in-law who works in IT at a very large bank, and he always says to me, so you've got a backup. Congratulations. How are you going to get it back? And this is a problem. This is a real paradox, that you need to secure the data in such a way that the hackers aren't going to get at it, but at some point you may need to retrieve the data. That's why we back up. And if you don't think you need to ever retrieve the data, why are you saving it? So these paradoxes are very, very important. And there's a further one which comes back to my friend Milton. One of my students said, he's your boyfriend. Milton Friedman is dead. He's not my boyfriend. But Milton Friedman said, most people collect and gather their wealth in their lifetime to pass it on to their children. That's why we gather wealth. Now, look, there's the odd person out there who's lovely and leaves it to the Spotted Owl Society or whatever. But most of us want to leave it to a favourite nephew, a stepchild, an adopted child, but we have the next generation in mind. And it may even be a charitable cause that supports the next generation. But the idea is you have a say in what happens to your wealth after you die. But if your data has been so secured that it can't be hacked, who's going to access where the wealth is? So the paradox is that for as long as we're alive, we actually like our financial privacy. In fact, a lot of us like financial secrecy. As soon as we're dead, not so much. And I mean, like, there's a very good example with deceased rock stars who had their wealth in a Cook Islands trust account because they're trying to avoid tax, and then they die in a hotel and nobody knows where the money is. And everyone says, oh, the guy in the Cook Islands was the trusted advisor. I don't think so. And they're not going to bust a gut to find out who the beneficiaries are and advertise in the Sydney Morning Herald that there's $8 million available for grabs. So these paradoxes are very, very difficult when we think about automation, how we trust data, how we manage it, and how we retrieve it, and whether we need to at all. So that's the last slide, and I just wanted to, I think we're actually going to hold questions, and I will be here afterwards hanging around, and people can ask me questions directly. But I just wanted to finish with just a little bit of where the standards work is going, and just say, we accept that there are some standards that by default will become what are used in relation to technologies. So maybe the Ethereum smart contracts will become a standard. Standards is involved in is concerned about three things. The first is market liberalism, making sure everybody has a chance to play in a way that doesn't offend these anti-competition rules, so supporting competition. The second one is interoperability, and as a lawyer I have to say, I think we all need to think about government regulation, government systems and processes, and the law as systems that should be regarded as necessary when we talk about interoperation. So interoperability, not just of how does the blockchain fit with an Excel spreadsheet, but how does blockchain fit in with legal systems and human systems for things like data retrieval and data breach. And then the third thing Standards is really interested in is reputation. It wants to make sure that the technology that's being explored can have a reputation that can be relied upon. And that is part of the trust story. That is something about saying, well, it's one thing to say, I'm going to use this telco, this bank, and I'm going to have a certain relationship with my government and pay taxes and then do business. But if all the tech that it's sitting on can't be trusted, then you've just got more delay, and that becomes a major pain point in its own right. So the Standards work is about trying to support that kind of trust with the tech, and then the hope is that the trust in the tech leads to trust in the humans on the other side of it. Because in the end, it's actually just about the human interaction and everybody wanting to do business as usual, but just in a different kind of future. So I'll be very happy to have questions afterwards, but thank you.